the Genesis creation story is a lot more complex than it initially appears. And I remember growing up, learning about the Big Bang Theory, learning about the evolution of life over billions of years, and reading the sort of 7-day timeline written in Genesis, thinking, well, these things do not match. Both can't be right, surely.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to the 8th episode of the Good Dialogue podcast. This one's going to get pretty meaty, I think. Luke's just brought out a book, Luke, my co-host. It's called Does the Universe Paint God Out of the Picture? So if you're interested in black holes and Stephen Hawking and multiverse theory, and you're also interested in Genesis 1 and the Bible's account of things and how does it all fit together, then we're going to start exploring the early chapters of Genesis and modern science. So I just want to read out just a little quote. You quoted St. Paul at the start of your book. In Romans 1, verse 20, it says, "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature," that's God's invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So there's this idea that we should be able to look out in the universe and understand through science how things fit together. And Paul's saying we should be able to look out in the universe and understand something of what God's like. But yet when we look in the early chapters of the Bible, we find things that you ask anyone on the street and they think, oh, hasn't this all been debunked by modern science? So how do you make sense of Genesis 1, the creation account, and how it fits with modern science?
Yeah, that was well put. I think that, and that's really why I wrote the first section of the book about Genesis 1, because it's really a book about the science of the universe, the science of the origin of the universe and our general understanding and the different theories and about the structure and origin of the universe, and why I think that points to a higher intelligence behind the universe, and why I think that's rational and a scientific induction, although it doesn't necessarily point to a specific God or God per se, although I make that extra claim. And I think a lot of people can't even get there because they're familiar with these sort of ancient creation stories. And, you look at the most common, the Christian Genesis creation story, and you think, well, that's directly, conflicts with our modern scientific understanding. So if you come up to me saying that our science suggests there's a higher intelligence behind the universe and you want to try and provide a rational and scientific induction as to how you got there, well, actually, I'm not even going to. They can't even get there because they've already written it off. They've already written the notion off. So I think it's important to address that. And I think that the Genesis creation story is a lot more complex than it initially appears. And I remember growing up, learning about the Big Bang Theory, learning about the evolution of life over billions of years, and reading the sort of 7-day timeline written in Genesis, thinking, well, 6th day, but I think these things do not match. Both can't be right, surely. And so I kind of raised my concerns with other young people who had a similar issue in Christian circles. And there's 3 sort of common views. There's sort of young earth creationism, which views the days in Genesis as a sort of a literal 24-hour time period. I don't think many Christians really believe this, or I think a lot of older Christians, I think, tend to have this view, but I don't think it's as common anymore. And I don't think it's the right way to view it. So they look at the earth as literally 6,000 to 7,000 years old. Then you have old earth creationism, which is the second common view in Christian circles, which is the days are long periods. So potentially these days represent millions of billions of years. There's one scripture in the Bible which says a day to the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day to the Lord. But so they refer to that and say, well, actually, okay, the 6 days in creation, it could have been 6 billion years or whatever. And so they're trying to get it and make it fit with modern science. Don't agree with that view either. Then there's the framework view. And this is a sort of view which I found interesting, which to me made sense, which is actually the creation story is a theological construct. It's not a chronological account. And so you have to remember that Genesis was written within an original context and sort of literary genre. It was written to ancient Hebrews with their mindset. And so I found the framework view the most sensible because it emphasizes that rather than trying to make it match with modern scientific understanding, you got to enter into the ancient world to understand how would they have understood this on their terms. How would they have interpreted it? So that kind of started this whole exploration, really. And there was, there was a book by John Walton, whose work's been really helpful, and framed much of the first sort of section in my book, and I acknowledge him in that, which helped bring this to life and help have a deeper understanding of Genesis 1 and whether it has contentions with modern science that need to be addressed or thought through.
Yeah, that's really interesting. These big ways that we approach the text, and that'll impact what message we're getting from it. And so I think we need to kind of get into the heads of the original hearers, those who wrote it, to work out what they're actually trying to say, because they can use language that we can take another meaning from. So how can we accurately understand Genesis 1 in its original cultural context? What was the cultural context?
Yeah, the first thing is to remember something which is really obvious, is that it wasn't written to us. Well, not directly to us. It was written to ancient Israelites, and so, ancient Hebrews. So you have to remember, it wasn't written to address the questions of our modern scientific minds. It was written and it makes sense to God to communicate his message to the audience so that they can understand it. And then hopefully by us trying to understand not just the text, but the way the audience would have thought and interpreted the text, to have a proper interpretation of what the text is really about. And so we have to not just translate the language and the text, we also have to translate the cultural context in which it was understood. And a basic example is to try and illustrate this. If we think about the example of hospitality, so in the biblical context, hospitality was a very significant cultural practice, and this is exemplified in stories seen as Abraham in Genesis 18, and in many Middle Eastern ancient societies. Hospitality was seen as a duty, and sometimes even a sacred responsibility, that there were strangers, there were travelers, you were then meant to offer them food and welcome them in and give them a place to stay. Now, in our modern Western world, inviting a stranger into your home can be seen as risky. It can be seen as just unwise. And so to understand the biblical concept of hospitality, you have to appreciate it within the ancient world, what it represented, how it worked in their world, before just interpreting it with your modern mindset and thinking, no, that's just too risky. That doesn't make sense. And so we have to, and this is the really hard bit, we have to set aside, when you're reading ancient scripts, ancient texts, you have to set aside your modern categories, your modern ways of thinking, and immerse the sort of ancient world for a little bit. Now, this involves, when we look at scriptures like Genesis, not just reading Genesis, but reading the range of different ancient creation stories from different cultures at that time, to see what were the differences and what were the shared thoughts that they had at that time. So if I look at the whole ancient world and look at how they wrote and what they wrote and the stories they had, okay, they're not all going to be the same. We can accept that. But there's going to be similarities, which is going to give me an indication as to how they thought about things. And if I can get that, I can then get a better understanding of how they would have understood the sort of the creation count that we see in Genesis 1. And this is obvious. Like, think about leadership. Okay, so it makes more sense to look at how leadership or kingship is in ancient Egypt and Babylon to understand how the Israelites viewed and understood kingship than to compare it to our modern sort of democracies and governance and structures, because they all shared a sort of similar ancient Eastern cultural, frame. As our leadership, that's changed over thousands and thousands of years since then, with so many different movements and so many different changes and intellectual movements in there. And so the way that Israelite related to its neighbors, like Egypt and Babylon, is going to show is going to be more relevant than to how ancient Israelite relates to us, which is so far detached. And so there's something about looking at the broad ancient world to understand what were the common thoughts there, what were the common ways of thinking about things, which I probably don't have because we're so far removed. and then interpret the text in line with that. So that's really what we're trying to do when we read things like Genesis 1.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think translators of scripture, it's much easier for them to translate words than to translate concepts. Probably easier for them to translate concepts than entire like cultural worldviews. I think one example is where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Like, what comes into your mind when you think heavens and earth? Maybe like when you think of earth, you probably think of a big sphere with 70-something% covered in water, and there's different continents, and there's gravity where it's in orbit around the sun, and there's a solar system, and there's galaxies. That totally wouldn't have been their idea of heaven and earth. In the beginning, when God began to create the sky and the soil, is probably more what would be in their heads when they heard about heaven and earth. So even just in the words we use, it can be a complete different understanding. I think a good example of this, where we have a certain context in our mind which makes us read something different than was necessarily intended, is where when God is laying down the law and he says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And we think in our modern context where, you take someone's eye out, you go to prison for GBH or something, but you don't get your eye taken out. So our frame of reference is a lesser punishment. So to us, looking back, we see an eye for an eye as really brutal. But in their context, before there's any law, it's like, well, someone puts two fingers up at you, why not kill his whole family? Because there's no like law of saying what the punishment should be. So it's in its time, it was one of the cornerstones of modern law is that the punishment should fit the crime, like no more than the original crime, don't escalate. And so their context was that it's a limiting factor. But because of our context, we read that as you better mete out punishment. But then it was, you better limit your punishment. And that's what cultural context does. It forces us to read something that wasn't intended to be said, as well as like this thing about heaven and earth. So so on the topic of heaven and earth, what do you think the ancient world would think about the physical aspect of creation? Because our scientific exploration is all about ultimately the physical. I mean, it's the naturalistic approach to science, physical first. Whereas this is a bit of a different genre. It's talking about the physical stuff, but there's a lot more like there's gods and there's people and there's talking snakes and stuff. So
yeah,
what's their concern with the physical world? Are they doing science but doing it badly, basically?
Not the science like it is today it wasn't the same form then, so they wouldn't have thought in terms of a scientific explanation. That wouldn't have even been their interest or their concern, and that's really important to note. It's ancient cosmology, meaning they didn't seek to describe the universe using modern scientific terms or to address our sort of contemporary modern questions. They lacked the level of knowledge that we have today about the material universe, right? I mean, they viewed the sky as as a solid, somewhat structure which held back the celestial waters, and believed that this sky, this is not necessarily the ancient Hebrews, but just the ancient world in general, that the earth was supported by pillars and then it floated on a big cosmic ocean. And that was common among ancient civilizations. And it didn't seem that God actually felt it was necessary to correct their view in the biblical text, mainly because the point of it wasn't to give a scientific account of how the universe came into being. It's trying to communicate something deeper. And sometimes you have to communicate someone's general understanding to get that point across. And this is the point. So there's an issue called, and when I initially picked up the Genesis account as a teenager, I tried to read it as if it had scientific concepts in there, and it doesn't. And this is called concordism, which is to try and read the text as if it actually matches with today's modern science, and we just have to better interpret it to get that modern science in there. But it's not. It's ancient cosmology. It was not written to address modern scientific questions. That's obvious. It's obvious when you think about it, but because it's so natural for us to think in those terms, it's not obvious when we read it. Like the ancient world, they didn't distinguish between natural and supernatural realms. We tend to have this natural versus supernatural dichotomy and this sort of framework of thinking. That happened a lot later in human history and human thought. They actually saw every natural event was the outcome of some supernatural move as such. And so the rain that fell, every child that born, every crop that grow, it was a result of God's direct blessing or curse. I'm not saying this is necessarily exactly what the ancient Hebrews thought, but this was the general ancient world and how they perceive things. In a sense, really, there's nothing natural about the world in modern biblical theology either. Like, I believe that God's thoroughly involved in the world in the sense that the mechanisms, the laws, and the scientific rules carry God's signature. They don't replace him. They reveal the sort of the genius of the God who made the world to operate in the way it does. And so, and as a sort of a side note, I think it's interesting that, the natural laws describe or hold a frame to the world. They're understood through mathematical formulas. Like, there's an elegance, there's a rationality, there's a logic there, which aligns with the idea that there's some sort of mind behind the universe. That's just on a very intuitive basis, you could say that. But the elegance within mathematical expressions. I mean, you have complex physical things explained through simple mathematical elegant formulas, which would seem on an intuitive basis suggest there's some sort of grand mind behind it all. However, it's kind of off topic a bit. The point is that they wouldn't have sought modern scientific explanations for the way the world is. And it was written to ancient Hebrews, not to 21st materialistic minds. So they would have thought about things in a very different way to how we would have perceived it.
Right. So if the ancient world didn't think in terms of physical creation, what were they getting at? How did they think about it?
Function, order. Ancient cosmology is function orientated. It's not material focused. Like we have a material ontology about things in the modern world. I would give in fact, let's go into some ancient sort of creation stories, because I think that will kind of highlight that. So they always looked at the purpose and the role of things and how they fit within a sort of cosmic hierarchy, in a governance, in a temple. They thought in that sort of function-orientated way. There's the Babylonian creation myth called the Enuma Elish. I wrote about this stuff, but I'm going to pronounce some of it wrong. That's okay. And there's this cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat, which symbolizes the triumph of order over chaos. And out of this, it creates that's victory, and the creation of the world from Tiamat's remain signifies the establishment of a sort of structured universe or structured world. And also in that Babylonian creation myth, it talks about the hierarchical relation between gods and humanity, and humans there to serve the gods, reflecting a universe that was to have some sort of social order between gods and between the gods and between humanity. And so those are the questions they were thinking about. What's our purpose? What's our role? What's the role of the trees around us? What's the role of how we relate to the gods? Egyptians had a similar type of way of thinking about things. They believed that there was a different god for different parts of the cosmos. And so you had to please the different parts of the different gods to get favor on those different things. So if you wanted good crops, well, you pray to the god of weather. And so they viewed very much the creation in terms of function, in terms of the role between gods and humanity. And carrying out rituals to please those gods in order to get favor from those gods in the sort of the material sense. And we can think about creation in a functional ontology too. Like if you think about the creation of a curriculum, for example, okay, it's the curriculum really. If you create a curriculum, you're really talking about the creation of ideas and framing those ideas. And obviously, the curriculum eventually takes a physical form in the form of a book. But the creation is not a physical process, really. It's a mental process. It's a function-orientated process. If we talk about water, if we were to describe the existence of water, right, we would talk about it in terms of its chemistry, H2O, because that's the way our modern material scientific minds think. If an ancient person was to think about the creation of water, they would think about it in terms of the role it serves in its sphere of existence. It helps crops grow, and it provides water for me to drink, it allows me to exist. They would have thought about it in terms of the role it serves humanity and the role it serves in the world. It's a very holistic, interconnected way of thinking. And unless something is working in an ordered system, one that is useful to people, in their minds, it didn't really exist, right? So if we talk about the creation of, like, I'm sitting on a chair right now, and okay, modern materialistic minds will look at the chair and say, if we have to talk about the existence of the chair, we talk about the wood, we talk about the screws, we talk about the plastic to connect it, whatever, the cushion, the fabric. But that's not how the ancient world would talk about it. And when we see it all put together, then a chair exists. Now, that matters to the ancient world, but really, you could have a chair, but it doesn't really exist until it's made for someone to actually sit on. So you have a chair, but it's just sitting in the corner. In functional ontology, it's actually non-existent. But only when you bring the chair for someone to sit on, now it exists because it serves a purpose. So it's about assigning a purpose and a role to things. They might already exist in a material sense, but only once they're integrated into something useful, into something functional, does their existence come together. Another example I give in the book is about like a theatre performance, for example. You could have a play, and you could talk about the material creation of the play as the stage and the lights and the ornaments and all the different features and the costumes. But actually, in an ancient world, the play only exists when it's ready to perform in front of an audience who are coming and arriving at the play. And then once it's taken part in something bigger, now it's coming into existence. And so that's how the ancient world, I'm trying to use modern ways to try and capture that. That's how they would have thought about creation in that sort of way. And we see this all for ancient creation stories. The ancient Egyptians, for example, they thought about the world from coming out of the primeval waters of none. It's sort of this differentiated, chaotic state. The Sumerians depicted the universe originated from a chaotic, sort of expanse. And it's a common theme, even in Greek mythology, about the world coming from sort of chaotic, non-ordered, undistinguished state. There's no rituals. Everything's merged together. And it's about assigning order out of that. You see this all throughout the ancient creation stories. There's very, very rarely, I don't think there's a single creation story where it talks about actual material being made as opposed to order being established. So when we read Genesis, we have to think of that same mindset. It's more about they're reading it in the sense of the order being established in the world, not necessarily about the material way of how things come to be. We tend to think in terms of, when we talk about creation, we tend to think in terms of how. What's the physical laws? What's the physical mechanics for something to come into existence? Ancient world thought in terms of why and who. They viewed the kingdom as they viewed the cosmos as a kingdom or a temple. There was some sort of governance in there. And so it's not about the existence of the material. It's about the functions and roles within an ordered system. You've got to keep that mindset as we then read Genesis 1 to understand what the creation account is really about. Does that make sense? That was a bit messy, but hopefully that gets the point.
Yeah, I think that absolutely does make sense. I think the key quote from what you said there, you said, in this view, an object could be physically present but not truly exist without a functional purpose. So it's more like when we read the word creation, we imagine the invention of material from where there is no material. But this idea of creation, it's more like when you create a garden out of a wasteland. So there's already the components there. You're ordering them. You're chucking the weeds over the fence. You're creating space for this plant. You're moving things into the right place. That kind of creation. And in fact, creating a garden out of a wasteland, oh, wouldn't you look at that? That's familiar. It's creation of a garden. I've heard that somewhere before. So what you're getting at with this is, like, when we read Genesis, did they understand creation in terms of God creating function, ordering the universe, rather than a material creation, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's dead on. They held that same sort of perspective. They're talking about the creation in terms of assigning that sort of purpose and function to things. Should we just get into the Genesis 1 account and just break that down quick to see how it goes? So the Genesis 1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's not actually a good translation. There's a better way to understand this. And there's a more accurate translation, which is in the initial period in which God created the heavens and the earth. So it's not in the beginning, it's in the initial period, because in the beginning gives a sense that we're talking about the sort of the assumptions about the nature and origin of time, right? Which is not what the text is getting at. That's how we'd want to read the text, because we think in those terms. But actually, the more accurate interpretation is in the initial period. So it's not necessarily making absolute claims about the origin of time. It's more talking about in this initial creation period, right? God created the heavens and the earth. Now, what does create really, really mean to the ancient Hebrews? Well, the word create here is definitely got an A.
Bara.
In Hebrew. Bara.
Bara.
Bara. There we go. That's the term which is used in Genesis 1, verse 1 to talk about create. Now, it's about 50 odd times in the Old Testament that it appears. For example, in Psalm, King David, writing a prayer to God, he asked God to create in him a clean heart, a pure spirit. It's not talking about a physical creation of anything. It's talking about a sort of spiritual cleansing. It's talking about a spiritual transformation, not a physical creation. In Isaiah 43, God uses it to describe it's used to describe God creating Israel into a chosen people. Again, not a physical creation, but an identity of Israel. And actually, within the Old Testament, no example of bara clearly indicates a material understanding of the word. So they've carried the same ancient world perspective of creation, of to create, in terms of a sign and function, in terms of a sign and purpose. John Walton argues a lot into that in his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, which is really good. So it's not necessarily material origin. So in the initial period, God created by a sign and functions through the heavens and the earth. That's the better way to interpret Genesis 1, verse 1. You see how right now you just have a completely different way of looking at the text? It's not in the beginning God physically created the heaven and the earth. It's in the initial period, God's created by a sign of functions throughout the heavens and the earth and starting to establish order. And we can see this, right? The term used to describe, if we're talking about material origins, we would start with an absence of material. But the text doesn't start with an absence of material. It starts with an absence of roles. It starts with an absence of purpose, like the two verses in Hebrew. Again, I'm not going to pronounce this right, but tohu and bohu. Formless and void, empty and desolate. That's the English translation. It's not talking about an absence of matter. It's talking about an absence of order. And, in Isaiah and Jeremiah, it talks about God bringing judgment into an utter desolation and chaos that results from God's judgment. And so this is used to say that before God created the earth to be before that, it wasn't inhabited. It was formless. There was no order and purpose to it. And so it's really describing a state of non-functionality. There's no clear purpose or role. And that fits with the sort of other ancient creation stories we see from Egypt and Babylon and so on. So that's how we should understand create. Makes sense.
That's fantastic. I feel like we're just getting started. I think we're going to leave it there for this episode. And next episode, we'll get cracking straight into the actual days of creation.
The days.
Looking forward to that.